Hello, my name is Professor Jen Snowball and I'm the Chief Research Strategist from the South African Cultural Observatory and also Professor of Economics at Rhodes University. So what we're going to be talking about today is a tool that was developed by myself and by a professor from the US, which is free, available online for anybody to use to work out the economic impact of a cultural event or especially a festival. Before we get into the tool, we need to talk a little bit about what economic impact studies are. Economic impact studies are a measure of the new money that's attracted to an impact area, like a town or a city, as a direct result of a festival or an event. And it counts the initial spending as well as the way that that money circulates through the economy. So economic impact studies answer the question, if the event hadn't taken place at all, then what would the loss of economic activity have been to the impact area, like the town or the city, could also be the municipal district or the province. So an economic impact study measures only the financial value of a festival or event. And we know that that's not the complete value, so you might want to consider other ways to capture the cultural value of what you're doing. So when should you use an economic impact study as part of the valuation of your event? Well, firstly, because it's this with and without thing, only those that attract people from outside of the impact area bring in new money. So if you've got a wonderful festival, but mostly local people come, so there are very few visitors from outside, then probably this is not the method that you want to use. So it works really well when it attracts tourists from outside of the impact area. It also works well when tourists stay over, so that they spend money on, for example, accommodation and food, and maybe there are other spending opportunities like tickets or souvenirs. And it works when organisers get sponsorship from outside of the impact area. So for example, if you've received some funding from the Mzansi's Golden Economy Initiative, then that would usually be from outside of your impact area. It's national funding, and so you could count that as part of organiser spending. Economic impact studies don't work so well when events are mostly about local people, so when it attracts mostly local visitors and local performers, where you've got mainly day visitors, so people don't stay overnight, and there are few spending opportunities, and where the sponsorship comes mainly from inside the impact area. Now, that's not to say that these are not valuable. So, for example, there are schools festivals that have huge cultural benefits for the children that participate, but it's not really a tourist kind of opportunity, and so that means that probably you should think about some other ways of valuing your event. So what does the South African Festivals Economic Impact Calculator, or SAFEIC, actually do? Firstly, SAFEIC can be used to estimate the economic impact of a festival on the host economy. It's been carefully and conservatively designed so as to produce results that are reliable and valid, across as wide a range of events as possible. And we know that different festivals have very different aims, they have different lengths, they include different kinds of performers, and so we've tried to make it as adaptable as possible. The advantages are that it's quite easy to use, doesn't cost anything, so there's a limited amount of information that you need to put in, and it produces a reliable result that organisers could use to ask for more funding, to prove the value of their event, to host cities and communities, and could use as part of their marketing material. The disadvantages are that it uses averages, right? So there are assumptions about how these festivals and events work, and we use average numbers from a huge range of studies that have been done. That means that it might not fit a particular festival or economy perfectly. So it doesn't take the place of that kind of very detailed and specific private kind of study, but at the same time, those are very expensive, and this one is for free. You do need some minimum data requirements in order to run SAFEIC. So if you're a researcher, you would need to engage with organisers to try and determine what some of these numbers are. If you're an organiser, you should have all this information at your fingertips. So if you have a look at the table, you can see that some of the information is about the festival itself. So the number of days, the population of the impact area, so that's for the town or the city or municipality where the festival happens. This you can easily get from the Stats SA website. The total number of people who came, so you might use ticket sales or crowd counts to estimate that. Average accommodation cost, so how much does it cost on average per person per night for people to stay over, and the average spending on non-accommodation things, so that would be like food, souvenirs and so on. Now, if you don't have this information, so you didn't run a visitor survey, we've provided some averages from the South African Domestic Tourism Survey that you can use. But of course, the first best option is that you have actually asked some people during the festival to share this information with you. At the back of the South African Festival's Economic Impact Calculator guide, the booklet, you'll find a draft questionnaire that you can adapt that will help you collect that information if you want to. Then you also need some information about sponsorship, so who sponsored the festival, were they from inside or outside the impact area, how much did they give, and total organizer earnings, for example, from tickets or from renting stalls, selling programs, and all those kinds of things. So, if we look at the screen, this is the first page that you'll see on the South African Festival's Economic Impact Calculator, and you'll see that there are 3 buttons. Frequently asked questions, a place where you can download the complete guide if you want more examples and details, and the Getting Started button. And that's the one you click to enter the calculator. The first thing that you're going to need to do is to decide on your impact area. So what do you mean by local? Is it your town or your city? Is it your municipal area? Is it just part of the municipal area? Is it the province, the district? Okay. And so that's a very important decision that you need to make, because remember, you don't count local spending. So you only want to count spending from outside of your local area. So who is local and who is a visitor? It also feeds into things like the local capture rate. So it talks about the size of the economy and how money moves through the economy. And it determines the size of the multiplier, the re-spending of that money in the economy. So you need to think quite carefully about what your impact area is. How should you decide? Well, firstly, think about who the main stakeholders are. Are we talking about people in a particular city or town? Is it more about a municipal area, or maybe it's more about a province? Who are the main sponsors of the event? What will they be interested in? If they're provincial sponsors, they might want to know about the impact on the province. If they're local sponsors, they might want to know about the impact on the town or the city. So that's the first decision that you need to make. Is a bigger impact area always better? The answer is definitely no, because of this locals versus visitors thing. So for example, if we were to take Grahamstown, where the National Arts Festival happens, if we just make our impact area Grahamstown itself, then everybody who comes from outside Grahamstown is a visitor, and we can include their spending. If we make the impact area the province, then that means that anybody from the Eastern Cape counts as local, and we can't include their spending. So while the leakages of money might be reduced if your impact area is big, and the multiplier effect might be bigger, your number of locals increases as your impact area gets bigger. The nice thing about SAFEIC is you can run it as many times as you like, so you can actually do 2 versions, one for a town and one for a province. Right. Now, deciding on your impact area means that you need to enter some data into the calculator, and what you can see here are the kind of categories. So this is not, your impact area is not a number of people, it's a category. So for example, if your population is 10,000 or less, then you're category 1. If it's 10,000 to 149,000, you're category 2, and so on. And altogether, we've got 6 categories that you can choose from. So all you would enter is category 1 to 6. as I said before, if you don't know this information about your town or province or impact area, you can easily look it up on the Stats SA website. So the first page of the calculator looks like this, and you'll see that really what you need to enter here is just two things: the length of the festival, so how many days is it. If you have information about people staying on either side, these are called supplementary days, pre and post festival, you can enter it, otherwise just leave it blank, and the size of your impact area. I'm just expanded that so that you can see exactly how to enter it. So ring there, you can see the place where you enter the category. So very important, don't enter the number of people, just enter the category from 1 to 6 of your impact area. So the next important thing to think about are your visitors. How long do they stay? What do they spend on? And how many of them are locals? Almost all festivals, at almost all festivals, visitors make up a very big part of the spending. So you can see some examples on the slide. This is from research that the South African Cultural Observatory has done at various festivals. And you can see that organizer spending, which is the blue part, really makes up a minority of spending at most festivals. Not at all, and especially ones related to the youth. Then organizer spending might be big and visitor spending might be small because they're school children, right? But for most festivals, kind of more than 70% of the total spending is made up by visitors. Now, the calculator relies very heavily on you to determine the number of visitors who came. And so the more reliable you can make this number, the better it's going to be. If you enter an unrealistically large number, then the calculator will give you an unrealistically large estimate of economic impact, and people might be a bit skeptical about that. So the best thing is to try and find some information on how many people came from some data that you have got. For example, how many tickets did you sell? Did you do crowd counts? Perhaps there was some clicker activity or any kind of other way that you can collect data about how many people came. If you want some ideas about how to calculate visitor numbers, there's lots more on this in the guide with examples from how it's been used at other festivals. You also need to know how long people stayed. So this is especially for longer festivals. If you have a 4 or 5 day festival, it's unrealistic to assume that everybody stayed for the whole festival. So the calculator will assume that people stayed for an average of half the festival time. But if you have some other information on that, from a visitor survey, for example, then you can replace that assumption. There's also some information on spending required. And as I said, we do provide some guidance here from the South African Domestic Tourism Survey. But if you have other information, then you can enter that as well. Now, how many people who came were actually local residents, right? So maybe 5,000 people were at your festival, but some of those would have been from inside the impact area. Now, you can report those as part of festival attendees. They were people who benefited from the cultural experience of the festival. But as far as their economic impact went, it would be pretty much zero. And that's because they were there anyway. So remember, economic impact with or without. So if the festival hadn't taken place at all, what would the economy have lost? Now, local residents live there anyway. They buy food anyway. They travel around. So their spending is not really new money that's coming into the economy. So one of the mistakes that we see made in economic impact studies often is people also include the spending of local visitors, which is not correct. Now, if you have information on the percentage of local visitors, you can enter that into the calculator. If you don't, there are default values that you can see here behind me. In general, for large cities, you would actually get a larger proportion of local visitors. So you can see that if your impact area is category 4, for example, so that's between 500,000 and just under 1 million people, then we're assuming that 65% of your visitors were actually from inside the impact area. What about visitor spending? So visitor spending is most accurately collected from a visitor survey. So you ask people where they stayed and how much they paid per night. But visitor surveys can be quite expensive to run, and so if you don't have access to that, we've provided some guidance. This is from the South African Festivals Economic Survey of what domestic tourists do. So these are South Africans traveling within South Africa. What were their average spendings? And to make it a little bit more nuanced, we've done it per province. So you can choose the province in which your festival took place, and you'll see that there are some averages there. And we've divided it into accommodation and other spending per person per day. So for example, in the Eastern Cape, you can see that the average price of accommodation was 458 Rand per person per night, and other spending was 305 Rand per person per day. Now you might think, well, that doesn't really suit my impact area very well, but remember, this is an average that includes people who stayed at backpackers and people who stayed at 5-star hotels. Again, if you have other information, for example, from an accommodation guild, then you could use that as well. Now, not all the visitors who come to your festival are going to be there directly as a result of the festival. And this is especially true where you have bigger cities where there are other things that might attract tourists. So we need to be careful not to include what are called time switchers and casuals. So only the spending of visitors who are there specifically to actually attend your event or festival should be counted. People who were there for other things, for example, they were visiting friends and family, they were there for a conference and happened to come along to your festival, well, we can't really count those, because even if the festival had not taken place, they would still have been there. If you've got information about this from a visitor survey, for example, you can enter the numbers. And the question usually goes something like this: is this festival or event your main or only reason for coming to Grahamstown or Cape Town or the Eastern Cape? And for the people who say, yes, this is the main reason, if it wasn't for this thing, I wouldn't be here at all, you can count their spending. If they said, oh, well, I was thinking of coming here anyway to visit my mum or my friends, or I'm here for a conference, and then I thought I would look in at the festival as well, you can't really count that, because they would have been there anyway, even if the festival had not taken place. Now again, the calculator has got some default values built into it, which you can see on the slide. So it's all basically connected to your selection of the impact area. So you can see why it's so important that you think about that quite carefully. Again, larger cities, so the bigger your impact area is, the more likely it is that some of those people would have been there anyway. So if you think of Cape Town, which is a really big city, there are lots of other reasons for people to be there. If you think of Grahamstown, it's a really small city, big arts festival, most people are there mainly or only to see the festival. If we have a look at the calculator itself, so this would be the second screen, you can see that there's a space at the top that says enter the total number of attendees, right? And so that's where you need to fill in the total number of people who came. All this other stuff I've been talking about, so including locals and time switchers, casuals and so on, the calculator's got embedded values that it will put there as defaults. You can override these if you want to, but unless you've got really good information from a visitor survey, we suggest that you leave them as it is. And then from this, the calculator will work out for you how many visitor days your festival resulted in. So another group of people that we need to think about for some festivals are artists or producers and media reps. Now this only applies really to festivals that have a certain kind of structure. For media reps, it's only really applicable to bigger festivals where you have people from TV stations, radio stations, etc. Coming into your particular town to report on the festival. Now some festivals require that media reps actually register so they know who they are and where they come from and maybe even how long they stay. But remember that it only applies to non-local media, and usually only for the bigger events. You can get information on spending by media reps through a survey, like an online survey, or on registration, or you can use the SAFEIC default values. So we make some assumptions. Firstly, that media reps stay about the same amount of time as other visitors, that they spend the same amount on accommodation on average, but that they spend a bit more on non-accommodation spending because they're working. Another group is artists and producers. And again, this is only applicable for a certain kind of festival. Artists and producer costs that are not covered by organisers might be in a situation where artists come by themselves, so it's not a curated festival. Anybody can come, like in a fringe festival, and they then have to pay for their own accommodation, selling of tickets, booking of venues, and so on. At some festivals, organisers cover all of those costs. In this case, you don't need to worry about artists and producers because their costs will turn up in organiser spending, as we'll see just now. Again, it only applies to non-local artists and producers. If this is a big population, I really recommend that you run your own artist or producer survey, and you can do that quite easily because they're always required to register. But you can also use the SAFEIC default values. We assume that they stay a bit longer than other visitors because they need to set up and close up at the end. They have the same accommodation spending, but they spend a bit less than visitors overall because they're working. So they're not going to be shopping or attending shows. They're going to be involved in producing the art. So if we have a look at the SAFEIC screen that you would see when it comes to artists and producers, there's a space where you can enter the number of artists and producers that are from outside, not locals, and also that organisers are not paying for. If there aren't any, you can just leave the screen blank. Now we need to have a quick talk about local capture rates. So we've got spending by all these different visitors who come into your host economy because of the festival. But not all of the money that they spend is going to stay in that economy. And that's because goods might be sold locally, but they might be produced outside of the impact area. We also find that if there are sellers from outside the impact area, of course they'll spend on accommodation and food and so on, but they'll tend to take their earnings home with them. So that money won't stay in the host economy. In general, the bigger the host economy is, the larger is the local capture rate because you can source more goods and services from inside the economy. As you can see from the table, we're assuming that the larger host economy categories also have larger local capture rates. Finally, we need to look at organiser spending. So this would include earned income from ticket sales and so on, and also sponsorship, or what we refer to as unearned income. So only money that originates from outside the impact area should be included. So sponsorship from local businesses or municipality, for example, that shouldn't be included. Now, why not? Well, the thinking behind this is that even if your festival had not happened, the municipality would still have spent that money, or the local tourism office would still have spent that money in the town. So if you think of the economic impact as with and without, that money wouldn't have been lost to the host economy, even if your festival had not taken place. So this is why it's important to know, where does the sponsorship come from? Organiser spending is funded from two sources: earned income, so that's ticket sales, program sales, stall rental, all those kinds of things, and unearned income through sponsorship. For non-profit organisations, and I think for most festivals, organiser income is practically the same as organiser spending, and this is what the calculator assumes. But you can override this if it's not the case. So if income was more than spending, then you would go with the spending number rather than the income one. We also know that organisers don't spend all of their money in the host economy. So sometimes they will need specialist services, and for that they may have to go outside of their host economy, particularly if it's happening in a small town. So things like specialised lighting, camera equipment, stages, raked seating, marquees, maybe even some printing, If you're in a really small town, you may not have those services available to you, and so some of organizer spending will take place even initially outside of the impact area, and we need to take that into account. As you can see from the table, in general, the smaller the impact area, the bigger is the immediate outflow in terms of organizer spending. Big impact area, we assume that most organizer spending will happen in that area. So if we have a look at the SAFEIC page that you're going to see, this is the one about organizer spending. You can see that there's a place where you enter sponsorship, where you enter your earned income, and that the total of these two is then assumed to be income and expenditure, which you can override if that's not the case. And then depending on what your size or category of impact area you chose, you can see that there's an assumption about the amount of organizer spending that happens locally. If you are an organizer and you have access to detailed data, you can override this if your number is different. Okay, so the final thing now is your total economic impact. So we've added up spending from everything, and now we're ready to see what the results are going to be. So just to remind you, the spending that we've included is visitor spending, that's non-locals, non-local and producer and media spending, if that's something that's applicable to your festival, and organizer spending in the impact area. So the final step then really is to add all these up and to account for the multiplier effect. So that's the re-spending of the money in the local economy, which further increases the economic impact of the event. So if we have a look at the page on SAFEIC that you're on now, you'll see that it gives you a kind of summary showing you all of these different categories and what's called total captured spending in the impact area down the bottom. Now, the size of the multiplier, or the number of times that the money recirculates in the economy, again, depends on the size of your host economy. So a small host economy would result in large outflows or leakages, and so a smaller multiplier, whereas a large host economy would result in the money staying and being respent quite a few times, and so you can see that the multiplier effect is bigger. You don't need to enter anything in this page on the calculator. You'll see that the output multiplier is filled in for you, and that it also then works out your total economic impact, which is the captured spending times the multiplier. In this example, the economic impact was 3.8 million. So the final thing is your results and some other resources that you might find useful. SAFEIC asks you to enter your event name and logo, and then it will generate a report for you that you can download and share with stakeholders and with the media. Please be assured that we do not keep any of your financial data. The reason we ask for the name of your event and contact details is so that we can see who's using the calculator, and there's also a space where you can add a comment. Remember that the reliability and validity of your results depends on us, the model that we've designed, but it also depends very much on your inputs. So if you've miscalculated things like the number of visitors who came, then your results are not going to be a reliable reflection of economic impact. This is the screen that you'll see when you get to this point. There's a place for the event name and also a place where you can browse and upload your event logo. What SAFEIC will then do is to present you with a PDF report certificate. It'll have our logo at the top. It'll have all the information that you've entered and all the information that SAFEIC has calculated. If you want to know more, so you'd like help interpreting your results, so you want to see exactly how they've been worked out, then remember that at the start page, there's a frequently asked questions button that you can have a look at, and you can also download the whole guide, which explains in detail what the assumptions are and gives you lots of examples. What if your economic impact is considerably less than what you were hoping for? Well, then what we would suggest is that you think about other ways to capture the value of your event. Remember, financial value is just a part of the value of a cultural event. Now, we've also developed a monitoring and evaluation framework, again with lots of examples and suggestions for questions, and you can use that as well in order to think about other ways that you could express the value of your event. Thank you very much for your attention, and we hope that you find this a useful tool. Right, so what I'm going to show you now is how this actually looks online. So what you can see in front of me is the South African Cultural Observatory website. And what you do is go to Events Impact Calculator and click on that, and that'll take you straight through to SAFEIC. Here's the front page that I showed you before, frequently asked questions, the download for the booklet, and also getting started. So we're going to click on Getting Started, and that'll take us into the calculator itself. In front of each page, there's a description of what you need to enter, and there's also some help text. So if you click on the little question mark, it'll open some help text that'll give you more information about what you should enter. So on the first page, all we need to do is enter the number of days. So let's say your event is 4 days. It also gives you the option to enter pre and post days. This is really only for short events. So if it's a one-day event, you're pretty sure people stayed overnight, or you've got a visitor survey, then you can add more there. SAFEIC will fill in everything else for you. Here's where you need to enter the population of the local community. If you click on the question mark, you'll see that it opens up the categories for you. So once you've decided on your impact area, you work out the number of people, and then all you do is enter the category number. So in this example, let's say that your impact area has between 500,000 and 1 million people, then you just enter category 4. That's all you need to do on this page, and you click on the next. Now you need to enter the total number of attendees. So that's all the people who came to the festival as visitors. But you can also here include locals, and SAFEIC will apply the default values that we discussed earlier. So let's say that you reckon that your event attracted 5,000 people. You can see that here are the default values. We're assuming that 35% of them for an impact area of that size were non-locals. That gives us a total number of visitors. We're taking account of time switches and casuals. We're also making assumptions about the percentage you stayed in paid for accommodation. So you know that some people stay with friends and family. So we don't assume that everybody paid for their accommodation. And that will then give you these figures at the bottom, which is the total number of visitor days at this point here, and also divided into paid for and not paid for accommodation. So if you click on Next, now this is where you need some data from your visitor survey, or you need to go and have a look at the South African Festival's Economic Impact Guide. And that will give you some averages from the South African Domestic Tourism Survey. So we need to enter an average accommodation price. So let's just use the numbers for the Eastern Cape. So that was 458 Rand per person per night as an average, and the spending was 305 Rand on other things per person per day. And then you click on the Next button. Now in this screen, you don't need to do anything. It's just giving you a kind of a progress report. So you can see that it's worked out the total amount spent on accommodation, on things other than accommodation, the two amounts together, and then the total for visitor spending. Now we're on to the section about artists and producers. So remember I said that this may not apply to your festival, especially if there were all local artists or producers, or if organisers paid for them completely. So assuming that your festival doesn't have any artists or producers that paid for themselves, you can leave that blank and click on the Next. The same thing applies to media reps. So if you don't know how many media reps there were, or you don't think that there were any from outside your impact area, you can leave this page blank. If you want to, you could enter a number. So just to show you what happens when you do, let's say you assumed there were 10 media reps, then you can see that SAFEIC applies some weightings there, which basically works out what their spending would be. But let's assume that actually there weren't any media reps that we know about, then we can click on the Next. So here again is a summary page. So it tells you about visitor spending, it tells you about accommodation spending, separated from non-accommodation spending. If we'd entered any data for producers and media, you would see that there, and that gives you total visitor non-ticket spending. Remember, ticket spending is part of what we record from organizer income. Right, so here we are at the organizers page, and remember there's sponsorship and there's earned income. So non-local sponsorship, let's say that you got R1 million for your festival. Oops, just go back a bit, okay. And that in addition you earned 400,000 from selling tickets and programs and so on. Now you'll see that SAFEIC will assume that income is equal to expenditure, but you can override this if it's not the case. So if organizer spending was less than what your income was, because some of it was profit, then you could reduce that number if you needed to. It also assumes the percentage of organizer spending that happens locally. So for an impact area of category 4, that would be 65%. Now let's say that you wanted to see what would happen if you change that. So if you changed your procurement policy so that 80% of spending was local, then all you would do is delete that and put in 0.8, okay? And then you would be able to see what the impact of that would be on total economic impact at the end. Right, so if we click on the next button, this takes us to the final page. Here it explains about the results. There's the multiplier, 1.65 in this example, and total economic impact of 2.8 million. Now let's say if we go back and we're experimenting a bit and we say, all right, what if we can't increase our organizer spending locally to 80%? What if we can only do it to 60%, right? Then we can run it again, and you'll see that your economic impact has dropped to 2.4 million. So by playing around with some of the parameters, you can actually get a sense of what the effect is going to be if you change things like that. You can do the same thing, for example, for visitor numbers. What if we manage to attract 1,000 more visitors? Or what if we have a downturn? What would our economic impact be? If you click on the next button, this takes you to the page where you can enter your event name and upload your logo. And there's also a space for you to give us feedback and comments. We hope that you're going to find this tool useful, that you'll enjoy using it, and that you give us some feedback on how you think it can be improved. The Cultural Observatory provided this as a free online tool that we've developed specifically for cultural festivals and events. If you need more information or help, remember that at the front of the calculator there are frequently asked questions, and you can also download the whole guide, which includes a template for the visitor survey.